going to go from the big picture to the little picture, which is what I focus on most days when I'm doing my job.
Excuse me. Can you raise the mic, please?
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I'm really going to talk about houses and how you can apply some of these things and what to look out for when you're dealing with some of the things to try to accomplish some of the things that Lauren was talking about. So we want to start by talking about character-defining features. And whether you own a historic home or not, I advocate trying to understand the house that you live in, the building that you live in. So character-defining features is just a terminology that we use a lot to try to dissect and help people understand what makes their home or their building have the character that it does. And there is some breakdown to that. In the first program that you had, that was covered to a certain extent. I'm going to just touch on it very briefly. The other thing is that I'm going to ask everybody here to think about alternatives. There's always more than one way to accomplish something. And if you start to think about that, you may start with a certain goal and then find that there are 3 or 4 ways to accomplish that goal. Don't go with the first thing that somebody suggests to you or that you think of. Try to think of alternatives. I have don't let the salesman determine, what the solution is, because I know that one of the habits of homeowners and other owners, frankly, in my experience, is that when they have a problem or they want to do something, the first thing they do is they don't call an architect or they don't call, somebody who knows, has a more general perspective. They actually go to salespeople. They go to a roofer or they go to somebody who can do concrete. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that you have to question the solutions that they come up with. Because remember, alternatives. You will have, if you go to a roofer, for example, for roofing, you might get 3 different alternatives, and none of these alternatives match. So you can't even judge them against each other. So just what I'm saying is, you be the critic. You think about what you're being told and what's being suggested. Don't just accept what somebody tells you, even if it's an architect. So, and then with a historic building, one of the guidelines that we use in our office is we try to make whatever changes that we make to the house or to the site reversible. Understanding what the historic nature is, if we're going to change it, then we want to be able to erase it at some time in the future if it becomes more important to us to have the original historic nature of the building there. So I'm just very quickly going through character-defining features, and this is really a very basic list. You have to look at everything. You have to look at just the overall look of the facility, including the landscaping, the general form of the building, window pattern, door patterns, in other words, the fenestration, exterior materials, and vinyl siding is not a character-defining feature. I just want to let you all know that right now. Then there are secondary features like chimneys, fireplaces, window overhangs, and protection that has been added sometimes over the life of the building. And then interior characteristics. Now, one of the things with any historic home in particular in understanding character-defining features is that we advocate understanding the hierarchy of those features, okay? I mean, there are some things that are more important, that are more distinctive about any home that you're in. And you should be aware of what those are, because the ones that are the highest priority and the most important, you should not change. But there are other things that you might be able to fiddle with a little bit that will have less of an effect on the overall historic character of the building. And that takes a little bit of refinement, but you do need to think that way. So water conservation in particular is really about using less and capturing more. And Lauren was really talking about a lot of that in her presentation. I'm going to get more into some of the specifics. So one of the things in terms of catchment is, just as was discussed before, capturing water as it comes off of the house. Now, there are all sorts of sizes and shapes of these catchment systems. And the one thing that I wanted to kind of talk about is, and they can all be perfect and good for your house. One thing to think about, though, is that, for example, the unit on the left side is not a very big unit. It doesn't hold that much water. And if you live in a place that's relatively dry, which makes catching water even more important, the amount of water that you can store in these things is used up fairly quickly. And so sometimes you might want to think about doing something a little bit bigger. Now, this is a house in sort of where Kaimaki and Kapahulu come together. And it's not a particularly fancy house, but they actually started with like a 50-gallon collection system. And then they found, because that place doesn't get that much rain, they found that they used it up in no time flat. So when they redid this back area, they put in a 330-gallon containment system. And that waters their entire backyard, which is a combination, actually, of stone as well as plantings in a very dry environment. So there are times when thinking larger does make sense. You can go really large, but this would require a pump system and burying something in the ground, which will be very expensive. But it is an option, and it is something where you, if you live in a particularly dry environment, you may want to do this, because all of us know that even if we live in very dry areas, you can live in an area that gets 15 inches of rain a year, and you might get 10 of those inches in 2 days. That's the way it works in Hawaii. So sometimes storing large amounts of water might make perfect sense. Now, the other thing that I think we want to talk about that we're pretty conscious of is, obviously, if you want to capture water, you need gutters. Well, the kind of gutter that you use really should depend on the kind of house and the kind of roof edge that you have. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But these are three basic shapes of gutters. You can come up with any shape that you want. But the one on the left, figure 1, is really a very standard gutter style. You've all seen them on probably, hundreds of homes. These kinds of gutters can be roll formed out of sheet stock copper, aluminum, or galvanized steel. They're relatively inexpensive, and they have one other major advantage in that they have very few seams because they can be rolled continuously. The problem with them, you will see in a minute, is that they don't always work on every roof edge. And so just be conscious of that when we are looking at some other examples. So here are a couple of homes, or three roof edges. The one on the left is Nut Ridge, which is on Tantalus. The other one is, the one in the middle is another house up on Tantalus, way up on Tantalus. And this one, the last one, is just a little tiny, believe it or not, historic house called the Nurses' Quarters in Hilo. None of these roof edges have fascias. And that's really important, because if you don't have a fascia, something that covers the ends of the rafter tails, something that you can mount a gutter to, it becomes much harder to use that OG style, because you don't have any way to attach it other than nailing it to the rafter tail ends. And in the first two instances, you don't even have those to nail to. So you have to use a half-round gutter. on these particular, those kinds of installations. You could, in the one on the right, actually use an OG square-backed gutter, but you would be nailing them to the rafter tail ends. And that's a good way to split your rafter tail ends. And it also just really doesn't look very good from the inside. And it actually takes away one of the character-defining features of a house like that, because you no longer can see the rafter tails. So the house in Hilo just drips the water onto the ground, which is probably the best thing of all. But there are historic homes and other homes that do have fascias. And for those, the one on the left is actually at Kilauea Lighthouse. It's one of the quarters there. For those, you can use a square-backed gutter shape and mount it very easily, and it will work. And you won't, actually the good thing about it is that the fascia is wide enough that even as the gutter slopes, it's not that noticeable. So you can slope the gutter and it still blends into the background. Now that particular gutter, the one at the Kilauea Lighthouse site, is actually it's not a standard roll form gutter, it's a squarish gutter, but it still illustrates the principle. The house on the right is at Dillingham Ranch, and that's just an example of actually a regular OG style gutter that is mounted against fascia, against the fascia. So if you have exposed rafter tails, or you need to use a half-round gutter, there's various ways of hanging them. The one on the left has to be hung from a fascia. And actually, the Iolani Barracks in the courtyard has that style of half-round gutter. But typically, half-round gutters are going to be hung by, well, there's a variety of methods, and two of them are shown on your right-hand side, where you're basically hanging the entire gutter from the sheathing of the roof eave. And there are ways to allow that to slope and get to the drainage, to the downspouts. I kind of wanted to get into a little bit into materials. So everybody loves copper. I love copper, but I want everybody to understand that copper is also not invulnerable to damage. And this downspout is actually one on Tantalus that's been basically corroded. And one of the reasons for this, and it happens with copper in two instances. One is cedar roofs that get a lot of rainfall. Cedar actually gives off tannic acid, and it gets dissolved in the water and will react with the copper. And I've also seen copper really deteriorate with cedar siding or any other cedar that's near a shoreline, because the salts and the tannins of the cedar react and cause a lot of deterioration in copper. So copper isn't necessarily the right material. I actually really like it, and we use it a lot. I actually like lead-coated copper, but that's really almost illegal these days. But I think you have to think about the budget and the lifespan of your roof when you're thinking about downspouts and the material for gutters and downspouts. If you have a roof that's only a 30-year or a 30-year roof, why do you want to install a 50-year gutter? Because you're going to be ripping the whole thing off when you rip off the gutter, when you rip off the roofing anyway. So think about the life of your roof when you're thinking about the drainage system, because there's no reason to spend more money on the drainage system than you need to. I have the picture of the PVC gutters here. I actually hate them, but they are viable. They get sold at Home Depot and whatnot. The good thing about them is that they aren't subject to corrosion, but I will say that there are relatively few houses that I think you would get away with having a PVC gutter on in terms of aesthetics. And if it's a historic house, I would say absolutely not. Now, there are two pictures here from Mary Cook's house. 3 pictures from Mary Cook's house, so she's probably going to jump up. But I actually have these in here because these are really classic toilet fixtures. Now, that is a 5-gallon flush tank. That toilet fixture is as old as their house, which is 113?
37 years old.
Yeah. So that fixture is historically important. I'm sorry. And you will never duplicate it. And so in some instances, I would say you got to keep it. And this is one of them. I mean, this is classic. It will never be replaced. You just don't use it very much or at all. And that one isn't getting used anymore. But these are examples of some historic bathroom fixtures. And you have to look at them and see, for example, in the sink at the left, if you really want to conserve water, you aren't going to do it by, you can't stick a water conserving thing into that faucet. You just can't. So it won't fit. And one of the things, see this kind of thing, they sell these things, these valves that you can get to retrofit faucets and whatnot. But in really old fixtures, you really can't do this. And so one of the options, and again, I use this with some, you have to be careful because we like to save things that are historic and very historically important. So we like to look for ways to save them. If you need to, change a fixture to get something that is more water conserving, there are ways to do modern fixtures that have water conserving features to them that are period appropriate. And that's really important, period appropriate. Now, this fixture is in a mid-century modern house designed by Osipov. And I can tell you, he did not pick those fixtures for this. It is not period appropriate. I'm not even sure if it would have been period appropriate 400 years ago, but it's not period appropriate. So one of the things that we've seen a number of times is that people say, I've got an old house. Well, I want to pick an old-looking fixture. Well, a lot of times what they end up doing is picking something that's about 100 years too early for the style of the house that they're in, okay? I think it's really important to be as sensitive to, again, what is the character of the house? If it's a mid-century modern house, that is not the right fixture. And I don't care whether you like that fixture or not, it's the wrong fixture. So the other thing that I wanted to spend a little time talking about is getting water into the ground. These two houses are actually both new, and they were both built at almost the same time. They're very close to my house. The one on the left built more house than they had before, but they left a yard around it, and there's grass and a place for the water to go. The one on the right has not a blade of grass in the entire yard. And I know you guys have seen houses like this. There ought to be legislation prohibiting this, frankly, because what happens is the water runs down that driveway into the road, and the road becomes a giant sluice. And we're talking about flooding. I mean, these kinds of developments cause flooding. And all of our streets, I mean, where I live, we don't have any catchments. The streets are the catchment. This is a bad idea. And so wherever we can reduce the amount of hardscape, the better off we're going to be. So I'm just using a couple of examples. The shot on the right is actually, again, Mary's, the front yard. And they park on that front yard. Amazingly, it holds up remarkably well. I think lately she was telling me that it's been chewed up a little bit by tires, but every time I've gone there, there have been people parking on that grass. And generally, it looks really good. If you're worried about it, you can come up with things like grass pave. Now, this is a little big. this is a little big to pass around, but this is an example of grass pave that you guys can take a look at later. Essentially, it's a reinforced layer that the grass can grow up through, okay? And it comes in different sizes and shapes. This isn't the same as that. I wanted to talk a little bit about when this makes sense and when it doesn't. Because this kind of thing has also been unsuccessfully used. If you don't keep the grass healthy, I mean, if you're living in Manoa, you get plenty of rain, the grass does pretty well. If you're in a drier environment, Bishop Museum tried to use this stuff, and it was a disaster because they didn't keep the grass growing, and before long you just saw all the plastic broken up by car tires. So you need to be aware of the environment, because there are some environments where this will work really well and others where it won't. This is another example that I think can work very well. We use this in a small area near the Kaneohe Ranch, or at Kaneohe Ranch's headquarters, at the junction there where, I know you guys know where that is. And it works there because they get 130 inches of rain a year. I mean, the grass just grows right through this, and they hardly ever drive on it, so there's no problem. But again, if you're in a really dry environment, you're going to have to water the heck out of this and keep it trimmed in order to keep it looking good. So this works back in, way back in Nu'uanu Valley at Morgan's Corner, for example. They've used it at a development near there. That kind of thing works in those kinds of environments. But you have to be aware, because you don't want to end up spending all your water, expanding your water bill, watering the part that's supposed to be getting, letting water into the ground. So one of the other options, this is a permeable paver. This is something that's sold as a precast unit, and I will pass this around. You're going to find this very heavy, and this is only a quarter of the size of a normal paver. If you pour water on that, it soaks right into the concrete and is designed to go right through the concrete into the water table. Now, in doing something like this, if you want to be driving on it, there's a lot of prep. You can see on the right-hand side, there's all sorts of base course and additional work that has to be done to make this truly stand up to driveway paving. But if you're using it for a lanai or some other paved area behind you, you don't need to build it up and do compacted gravel and everything else. So it may be a simpler solution for you. And there are all sorts of other, this is one particular manufacturer. I will say that doing this is it will be more expensive than just doing a regular driveway out of concrete, because you have to do a lot of prep to get this thing to work. But the strength of something like that, it's really designed to handle whatever loads you want to put on it. You can use it for regular, just as a regular roadway. You can also do something like gravel or, ili stones or whatever you want, something that lets the water get into the ground. The concrete pavement that, Lauren, that you were talking about, has only been, that is a permeable pavement that you pour out, to my knowledge, has been used relatively few times in Hawaii. One place that you can check it out is to go to the Arizona Memorial Visitor Center, the parking lot that they have a little bit toward the Melka side. All the parking stalls were done in that permeable pavement. And the drive portions are solid, but all of the parking areas are permeable pavement. And so far, I will tell you, it's actually held up very well. And the Park Service did that as an experiment, because they weren't quite sure how it was going to work. It's been holding up very well. It's not cracking. It's actually quite surprising. So if you do want to check out what that looks like, I would just drive by there and check out their parking. So basically, that's it. I'm sure you might have you might have lots of other questions about how to apply these things to your homes, but I just wanted to give you some things to think about.
So we'll take questions now for both our presenters. We can bring them both up and then.
We haven't done that. Actually, that tank is owned by someone who works in my office, so I should ask her how much it costs. But the tank itself isn't that much. It's actually getting the water there. So you're right. If you go on, you just actually go on Google and you can find these things all over the place. I mean, you can probably find 100 different sizes and shapes and everything else that you want for these rain barrel systems. But I should ask Ann what hers is. Yeah, you can.
So yeah, it actually depends on like how fancy you want it, and also the scale. So the larger the scale, like if you see those, folks on the Big Island that might have the 10,000 gallon tanks, for example, those are relatively inexpensive. I mean, that's probably about they're about $10,000, about $1 per gallon. Whereas when you get to the smaller units that look a little bit more fancy, they can range more like $3 to $5 per gallon. So again, it just depends on how fancy you want it to look. And also, that's above ground units. Once you start going into underground units, as Glenn kind of showed, that can easily become, more like $10 or so a gallon. Yeah.
Is there a list of companies who do this and who can come to the house and give you a bid or something?
It's
Well, I know. Oh, sorry. So the question was, is there a list of contractors or folks who can actually install these catchment units? There is. I do know one or two companies that mostly are servicing on Oahu the Tantalus folks, and it's not that many folks that I know of that do that. Certainly on the Big Island, there's a variety of contractors over there, and I don't know on every island. It would probably take a little bit of inquiry to see who those contractors might be.
So it kind of depends on what you're after. I mean, if you're after a major catchment system, yeah, there are specialty contractors. Most of these, smaller catchment systems like those, they're installed by homeowners or the same people who are doing why am I talking into this? That's going there. Most of those systems are done by homeowners, or they're done in conjunction with the companies that are doing the gutter systems. And so there's a whole list of those companies that would be.
The 350-gallon example you showed in Honolulu,
Yeah.
does it require a pump?
No. And actually, if we went to that, there's an outlet at the bottom of that tank that you just screw a hose to. And you're using the water head above that to provide enough pressure. And in their particular installation, the area that they're watering is also slightly down from that. So they get a little bit of fall from that as well. But I mean, and that's the ideal situation. If you can catch the water and then route it to a slightly higher location, then gravity is going to take care of the rest of it for you, and you don't need a pump. If you do something like burying something under the ground, then you need a pump. And frankly, you need a pump because you're using that water mostly for irrigation, right? That you don't need a lot of pressure, but you will have to have a pump. And everybody who lives up on Tantalus or whatever who has a water tank, they have a pump, or typically they have a pump because you need more water pressure to take a shower or whatever else. And so, but in the simplest form, if you're trying to use it for watering your yard, you should just locate it in a way that you don't need a pump.
I'm going to go back to your question real quick, or just want to make one more comment. Another really great resource, and I don't know if they still. I don't know if they still do it, but the Board of Water Supply had a workshops for homeowners where if you would sit for one day and learn about their rain barrel program and how to actually hook in your rain barrel. They would actually give you a rain barrel and a full kit to go home with. And so this was, I think, $25 or something to sign up for, and you leave with the barrel. It's not very big. It's probably like a 30-gallon. Barrel and all the hookup equipment with instructions. So if you want to just to kind of get started and see how that goes, that's an easy way to kind of get yourself going.
You don't need a permit for any of this. You know how the city is. You gotta have a permit for this and that.
Well, so the question is do you need a permit for any of this? I mean, technically, if you're going to put a structure in greater than 3 feet, I think technically, but they don't really go after the barrels per se. Maybe Glenn can. I've never seen that happen. I've never seen anyone go for a permit by putting in, and it's not a permanent. Maybe it's because it's non-permanent. I don't know. But I haven't heard of, on a homeowner's level, going in for a permit. Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is, don't put it in your setback. Because any of these things, if they're in your setback, that you are violating the code. But by and large, if you keep these things out of your setback, you're not going to have any problems. Because it's just, all you're doing is catching water. I mean, you're not really doing it, you're not doing plumbing per se. If you install a central system where you're doing catchment for the entire house, for water use, like you have to on Tantalus or many places on the Big Island, yeah, then you need a permit. Because there's all sorts of things. You need electrical and plumbing connections to all of those. Whenever you have electrical connections or plumbing connections, you need a permit. That's the way it's set up. But you're catching downspout water. You can have anybody, single-family residential work, you do not need a permit for roofing or any gutters. It's not required at all. Painting and roofing. So single-family residential is given a pass on that particular part of doing work. Anything else is a little bit different. That's it?
I just had a question with regard to the gray water and capturing and placing in the ground. No concerns about groundwater? I mean, about what goes into the ground? Or?
No, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, so the question was, is there a concern about what's in the gray water and then getting that into the ground? So normally we typically always recommend trying to go towards more of those eco-friendly products if you are going to be putting it into the ground. Just to back up, just in terms of health concerns, so the main reason why different between gray water and our black water, and black water also includes our kitchen sinks, is mostly because of the types of bacteria that could be in that water. And everyone always asks me, why the kitchen sink? And so if you eat meat and all that kind of stuff, you're going to get those little particles of meat, and that's what can cause some of those bad bacteria. So gray water is different. It's not usually carrying that bacteria load. What it can be carrying, though, is the chemicals that you're washing your personal care products, for example. And so if you can move towards more environmentally or eco-friendly products, if you're going to reuse that water, it would definitely be recommended.
I'm in the process of having to repipe my house because it's old. And right now, in fact, today my plumber started coming to the roof and everything and the ceiling. And if it's possible, could I tell him to run a drain from the shower and from the, it's just a.
So the question is he's in the process of a remodel. They're knocking out walls. He's interested.
It's not a remodel,
Okay.
it's just a repiping.
A repiping. Okay.
If you have an old house, everything's starting to go about now.
True. Yeah. Right. So he's going to be replumbing his house. So here's the tricky part. So we technically are on the 2006 plumbing code, which means that technically some of those codes aren't in there. But for gray water, you certainly can do that in terms of diverting the gray water, because that is in the code. I thought maybe you're going to be leaning towards the question of putting any of your catchment water back in the building. And if that is the case, you could maybe plumb for it, but you'd have to have a way to valve it or somehow keep it within code for where it is today. But hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to bring that water back in for flushing toilets. But if you're just talking about separating gray water, that should be something you should be able to do now. And you just have to get a plan on where you're going to put it and size it appropriately. And another great resource is the Department of Health, our wastewater branch, has gray water guidelines. And they're very simple to follow. And you could easily probably be able to put those kind of calculations together. And so if you were to do it in that kind of a way, the city generally will want to see something that's accepted by the regulatory folks.
So it has to go underground.
You're right. So yeah, so all the gray water, the main thing is that you have to put that water, it can't pond on the surface. You put it in a subsurface type of irrigation, or in like a perforated pipe scenario with maybe some gravel around it, and then planted with some plants that do like water if you're going to be putting a lot of gray water out. So in that case, if you're in a dry area, you can put in things like some tropicals and so forth, because they're going to want to suck up that water. Don't put a plant that doesn't like water in your gray water garden, if that's not obvious enough. Okay.
So Lauren, you mentioned there was a stormwater rainfall resource which was put up by the university. How often do they update it? Because I noticed that the rainfall in my yard is huge compared to even just 5 years ago.
So the question was about the University of Hawaii Rainfall Atlas and how often they update that rainfall data. And it's a great question. Generally for, just to get people started and get their feet wet, can point them to that resource. And what's that?
Feet wet, so to speak.
Oh yeah, feet wet, so to speak, exactly, yeah. But it's the last 70 years of data up until about 2002 or 3. So we are about 10 plus years behind in many of those rainfall gauges. And if you're paying attention of that one slide I showed, that we are in a downward decline of overall rainfall. So you may not be getting as much of that anymore. And I didn't want to put too many doomsday slides up there, but there is a lot of projections being done by the University of Hawaii as well, looking at if this climate change kind of patterns continue, that we could be looking at potentially 50% less rainfall across the state by the next 50 years. So being able to, in essence, I think it's one of my favorite things if we can get more people with rain gauges and participating and collecting this data, because I think that'll be really interesting as a homeowner to know, almost like smart metering, understanding how much rainwater you're able or collecting. But also for the state, we can maybe utilize that data to better plan.
It seems like it's coming fewer times, but heavier.
Right, exactly. Yeah, right.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
This one's for Glenn, actually. So I have a historic home that we just bought. It's a family home. So what if I wanted to, say, replace the windows with something that was a lot more modern, but it could be reversed in the next homeowner, for example? Would that still be considered a historic home?
Ooh.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, the question is, can the windows in a house be changed and still have the house be a historic home, right? Okay, well, it depends on what you replace them with, but typically you want to save historic windows wherever you can.
This is mid-century, it's awful jealousies.
Well, yeah, well, I have this sort of, yeah, I mean, I can identify with your problem. But I do think that it becomes important to take a look at what the house was overall. I mean, jalousies are notorious for being leaky, frankly. And so it is a little bit of a problem, but the question is, how are you going to maintain the basic look of the house? Now, you're asking a really hard question, because most of the time we deal with historic houses that had double-hung windows or casement windows that somebody stuck jalousies in, and so we're actually going, yeah, let's change the windows. You're talking about a house that was built with jalousie windows. That's
67 years
tough.
old.
Yeah, that's tough because, I mean, if you replace them with, oh boy, I don't know, I would struggle with that one, boy. I'm struggling.
The answer is no.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the answer should be no, but we would have to take, you would have to take a look at what are the alternatives? Do you need to do it on every window? And, you know, just kind of do some analysis of
Only the jealousies.
you have picture windows and jalousies.
Yeah,
Do you have glass jalousies or wood?
glass.
Glass.
And wood, actually.
Yeah, glass and wood. We'll talk later. We'll talk later. No, what you're describing is very difficult because, you know, especially with the way people like to modernize houses these days, air conditioning is a problem with jalousies. You know, all sorts of things come into play here that are very hard to deal with, and it would depend on where you were doing it as well. I mean, which elevations you were doing it in, you know, I need,
Okay,
yeah, it's not an easy, you've asked a very hard question.
I have two questions. What's the local source for the hydroflow permeable pavers, and who does installation on that? So that's one question. The second is that pavement, the permeable pavement, can you use it for lanais? In other words, in place of concrete, or is just for?
Sure, yeah, you can use it. And what I was trying to say before is that you would not need to do as much prep of the ground underneath it in a lanai. And also, if you're going to be driving on something, you need to really get a very firm, stable base. So you need to over-excavate, put in fill that gets compacted, and then you put the pavers on top of it, right? It's still all permeable, but the reality is you do have to do a lot more surface prep. If you're really only talking about using it for your back lanai, depending on your soil conditions, you might have to do very little to get something in there that would be level. That particular paver is distributed by Evergreen by Deborah. Okay, and I do have some literature, which they so kindly gave me when they gave me the samples. And you can come up and get a sample later. There are other kinds of pavers. This is actually, the interesting thing about this particular paver is that it's very dense. I mean, it seems really heavy and solid and very durable. Yet I did in my office, I poured water on it and the water just went through it. I mean, it didn't go shh, but it actually seeped through it. And so it does work. So anyway, I can get you some material on that. Just let me know afterwards.
I could just add.
Can you estimate the price point for that material?
No, but actually I asked that question, but we didn't get that answer back yet because I'm curious about it as well. I mean, that material looks really, I mean, I actually am working on a project right now where I'm thinking that would be very applicable for a house in a very rural environment. And so I'm very interested, but they did not get us that cost.
I can help answer a little bit.
You know, have you used that before?
Well, I haven't used that particular product, but there's, generally they range anywhere between, I would say between like $10 to $20 a square foot. If you want to go a little bit, and that's installed, but if you want to go a little bit less expensive in terms of like, in terms of the installation and reducing contractor error, there's like it's called interlocking pavers. And so these go in, so the way the other pavers go in, you have to, basically the contractor has to lay each one exactly in place. The interlocking ones is almost like a little bit of just a puzzle. You just put it all together, and so it goes in much quicker. And you have a little bit less contractor error in the installation. Those are typically the ones I like, but you know, we do those mostly on commercial kind of scale, but certainly could be applied to your homes as well. And there's a whole variety of ones out there. Like I mean, I like Pave Drain. There's Aqua Pave. There's a lot of ones.
Well, there is, but you know, again, the permeable pavement, the concrete pavement that I was referring to, that's at the Arizona Memorial, that's an example of that kind of material. Okay. It is more expensive than regular concrete, and the number of installers who can do it is probably limited to too. You know, there aren't that many that do that. And so it is kind of a specialty product.
So
Yeah.
only because I had a project recently on Maui, and we were, looking at demonstrating some of this stuff at some of the resorts. We were kind of looking at it into all the options, and calling around. What's happening is actually you can contact like the Amerons and the folks who you might get the concrete from, and they actually can do a blending mix of basically putting in more of the that coarse material, the base rock, and putting more of that content in. And so there's actually is sort of a specification that they now work off of, and from my understanding, it actually just goes on like concrete, so it doesn't require special contractors. It's just you would set it just like you would a normal concrete. So it's just a different blend that they put in, and just having more of that larger rock material in there.
Two questions on the permeable material. Number one, have you had any issues with it, like settling underneath it? And number two, I know like concrete, if it's, like for example, if there's a drip from the downspout and it degrades a little bit, how does this help hold on?
So the question is talking about more or less the wear and tear of permeable concrete in comparison to regular concrete, or just does it have the same issues? Or,
Does it have the same issues?
I would say, my guess would be that it's yes, because you would, most of it's going to have to do with, the base and subgrade that you put in. And, one other big thing about at least the permeable pavement is that, over time, if you are not in a very wet area, you might get a lot of dust, kind of filling in the voids to some of those pavers. So you would have to, have it vacuumed occasionally if you're not getting enough rain to kind of push things through, more or less. So normally they're not typically the best things for super dry climates, because you're going to probably end up getting some clogging going on. And so I would say there's definitely a little bit more maintenance involved in that sense, just making sure your pavers don't clog. And then sometimes in between, if you get the pavers that are laid and they're, just grass areas in between, you just need to kind of make sure those are staying clear and open for water to get through.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that these concrete pavers tend to be made with a very high-strength concrete. You can get tiles made with concrete that are very durable. And because they're modular, there's actually a little bit more of an opportunity to adjust them if they get a little bit out of whack. I mean, that entire 4th Street Mall is concrete pavers. And I think that we've used concrete pavers in many locations without those kinds of problems, because in fact, the concrete strength, the PSI strength of that concrete is quite often higher than the concrete that you would typically pour to do a driveway. So, I think that there are some real advantages to using that kind of material, but I wouldn't worry about it deteriorating any faster than regular concrete.
This plastic grass thing,
Yeah.
does it last?
It'll last forever because it's protected. It should be underground. And this stuff is not exposed if it's installed properly. And what happens is you essentially install it on a prepared base, and then you fill it with whatever soil or amendments that you're going to use. The grass grows through it, and what you're walking on is grass. I mean, you're essentially walking on, if you will, dirt that's got grass growing out of it, and you don't have any perception other than the fact that it's grass. We actually used a material similar to this at the Doris Duke estate to use that as a handicapped ramp, grassed, but it was reinforced so it would be solid. You wouldn't, wheelchair wheels wouldn't be sinking into it. And for all extents and purposes, when you walk on it, when you look at it, it looks like a grass surface. but it's a
This
reinforced.
can't be driven on, can it?
Uh,
Can it be a
It,
driveway?
it can be, but I would not use it for really heavy loads. Where it gets exposed to really heavy loads, I would stay away from this material. But if you're talking about standard vehicular traffic, you could drive on this. And I mean, that's one of a really good thing that it can be used for, actually, is you can use it as essentially as a grass parking area, and no one would know that it's anything but grass. And what will happen is, when it gets wet, particularly wetter, normally when your wheels would kind of sink down into the mud, this will keep that from happening.
We'll take one more question, and then if you are able to stick around for 10 minutes or
Yeah,
whatever.
okay.
So as a whole, we're trying to cut down on plastic. And that's plastic.
Right. Well, don't float it out in the ocean, and that we'll be at a very good start. But no, I understand. But but we're talking about a choice between. I mean, and I outlined several alternatives for how to deal with essentially letting water get into the ground. This is one of those ways. Concrete pavers, the concrete grid block that you've seen, is another way. I find that to be even more problematic than this because, I mean, I've been in too many locations where you end up sort of tripping over it because there's big holes. None of these systems work if you don't get enough rain to keep the grass looking nice. They don't work, so don't even think about it. And so some sort of, in those cases, you can use other systems that even may be less permeable, but you should use them in conjunction with things like rain gardens and other ways to capture water and keep it on site. So there isn't one answer that fits anything, but if you want the grass look, a real grass look, this is probably one of the very few ways you're going to get it, and be able to park on it, for example. I think you're going to find that concrete grid blocks are not terribly successful. And the only time I've seen them successful is when they've been in locations that have, I would say, more than 80 inches of rain a year. So if you live in that kind of environment, you live in deep in Manoa or Nu'uanu, concrete grid blocks can be great. Otherwise, you're spending a lot of time and money trying to maintain them so that you don't trip on them every time you walk over them. So there's not one answer that fits anybody in this room, actually, and it's a combination. You have to think about combinations of answers.
Unless they should make those out of recycled materials.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. Let's give a round to our speakers.